What if I told you that there is a way that you can play Dungeons & Dragons without a dedicated dungeon master at the table? Fully co-op with more than one player? Well, watch to the end of the video and I'll show you how I came up with Together We Fall and where you can get it. So first and foremost, where does this idea come from? I actually had this idea pop into my head one day whenever I looked at this game called Escape the Dark Castle. It's a tabletop role-playing game that is completely played with cards. There's no dungeon master. The deck of cards is the DM. And you draw a card and you flip it over and it tells you the situation that you're in. And then the table makes a choice together.
Yeah,
I read the next card.
We push you.
After being pushed, guys, I think it's only fair. Okay. From the darkness ahead, an arrow whistles past your ear. Before you can react, another buries itself into your shoulder.
Oh, shit.
And you slump against the wall in agony. You lose 2 HP.
There's also another thing in Magic the Gathering where you can fight an AI-controlled deck without a computer. You just draw cards and then it tells you what the deck does. So I took those two concepts and I said, how can I make this but D&D 5e? And that's how I came up with Together We Fall. So traditional D&D involves a dungeon master running the game for a group of players. And the dungeon master carries the burden of having to place the train tracks down as the party's train moves forward, or they can pre-plan and run a module that was already created by somebody else. But the thing is, the dungeon master doesn't get to experience being a player character unless they make a DM PC, which is usually very frowned upon because they just insert their OC and take control of the entire game, and nobody likes that. That's an RPG horror story. So how can the DM play with the players is what I wanted to achieve. I wanted the DM to play a character unapologetically with the rest of the table, and how I came up with that was everybody is the dungeon master in this game mode. So before we get into how everybody is the dungeon master and runs the game, let's start at square one, character creation. Now unfortunately with D&D 5e, player characters tend to be quite overpowered, so what I did with this game mode was I dialed the knob down very low. I want the characters to be about a sword and sorcery level of power, but you don't have to follow these character creation rules if it's not your style. I just think that this is the proper way to run this game mode, and of course I like the OSR, grimdark, sword and sorcery gameplay, so let's take a look at character creation. We're just going to skim it really quick. Alright, so you'll see immediately you're going to roll 3d6 down the line for each ability score, letting the dice fall where they may. That's pretty brutal. A lot of people usually do 4d6, drop the lowest. No, in this game mode you're going to be a low fantasy character. Your hit points at level 1 are rolled. You cannot take the average, you have to roll. It's important. And then you add or subtract your con mod. After first level, you don't add your con mod to your HP. That's important. Then you'll see leveling. You level up every time your character survives a dungeon crawl. So this is a dungeon crawling game mode. It goes back to the roots of D&D, which is how the game should be played, in my opinion. You have gritty healing. You don't regain hit points from resting unless you spend hit die. Your hit points are hard capped at 35. Now a lot of you might be saying, that's too low, that's too low. You can take it off if you don't agree with it, but I think that your hit points should be capped so that you are mortal. Have somebody play a dedicated healer. That is why clerics exist. Life domain clerics are OP, so 35 HP with a life domain cleric, you're still going to get healed up a lot, fairly easily. And then I have implemented some old school resting rules, and I put some limitations on spells just to kind of warn you like what you should and shouldn't use. So that about covers character creation. Let's move on to the next section. So this section of the book is labeled Collaborative Storytelling. And what it explains is how everybody is the dungeon master at the same time, and that is an arbiter. Everyone shares the narrative and Together We Fall. The game runs without a standing DM. At the start of the session, you as a table decide one or more people to be the arbiter, and you can rotate out as needed. So what is an arbiter? They are people who interpret the rules, settle conflicts, and they prevent metagaming. Because this doesn't have a solidified DM that you can look to and say, can I do this, can I do this, can I do this, but what about this, what about this? The Arbiter is there to interpret those rulings. They're supposed to keep secrets, preventing metagaming. They also are there to settle disputes, because what players often do, and I'm pretty sure every table in existence has this, players bargain with the dungeon master. They try to get a good outcome. They don't want their character to fall 15 feet off that cliff, because God forbid they take a d6 of damage. No, the Arbiter is supposed to be there, and they have to remain neutral with rulings. So it's going to be a bit of a difficult role to fill, but I think people can handle it. And here's the thing, if an Arbiter feels bad about a ruling and they don't want to hurt somebody's feelings, you can let the dice gods decide with a d6 decider. So basically, anytime a conflict arises where one or more people are disagreeing on an outcome, roll a d6. On a 1 to 3, the worst outcome for the players happens. On a 4 to 6, the best one happens. As an example, Kara opens up as Arbiter, facing a white. She keeps its immunities a secret until Leo succeeds a religion check. So that's an example of the Arbiter preventing metagaming. So the Arbiter might actually have the stat block, and they can see it, but they don't reveal to the other players what its weaknesses are. Now, mid-session, let's say Kara switches with Dave. He takes over as the Arbiter. He warns Rory of the 80-foot chasm's deadly drop, but Rory insists on vaulting with the party's 10-foot pole, and Rory rolls a natural 1. Dave then rolls a d6 decider because he's a nice guy and he lets the dice gods decide what happens, and, well, he rolls a 3. So Rory is rewarded with a new character sheet. It's as simple as that. The Arbiters are just everybody collaboratively making sure the table is not metagaming. It's a pretty simple thing, I feel, and I think it actually helps with collaborative storytelling. So let's move on to the next section. So this next section is an interesting one. This is going to flip everything you know about D&D upside down. This is called Mitigation. I got this idea from my own game that I'm making called Ravens. So what it is, it represents your PC's defensive prowess. If you're a nimble rogue, it represents your dodging. If you're a fighter or a paladin, it represents your shield or your armor blocking and absorbing damage. So essentially how it works is anytime a monster attacks you, you make a saving throw. So just like when somebody casts Fireball and you're making a dex save, you make a mitigation save instead, and mitigation comes from your AC. And this section tells you exactly how to calculate it. So basically, your mitigation is you subtract 10 from your AC, and whatever number you have left over, that is your mitigation modifier. So how do you use mitigation? Well, basically, when a monster attacks you, it has a set DC to their attacks. It'll be noted on the stat block. They make an attack, you make a mitigation saving throw. If you succeed, it misses. If you fail, it hits. If you roll a natural 1, you are crit. And if you roll a nat 20, you get to use your reaction to make an attack back at the creature. Pretty self-explanatory, pretty fun. It makes all the rolls player-facing so that it actually feels like you're fighting a computer-controlled opponent. I think it's pretty fun. So let's move on to the next section. And this will probably be everybody's favorite section. This is how a creature stat block in Together We Fall works. So, I'm not the original creator of this idea. This actually comes from Wizards of the Coast in a way. So how it works is, if you look at the Mouth of Grolantor stat block, you'll see it tells you exactly how they act each turn. They have a little D10 or a D12 table on their stat block. I actually, popular to contrary belief, I actually don't see a giant floating stat block in front of me. Sorry to break your immersion. But they have a little chart on their stat block that tells you how they act each turn. So I took that idea and concept and I sort of delved into it a bit, and I made it so that it works with this game mode. So you'll see here, looking at this stat block, the Orc Raider has an arsenal of weapons that it uses, and it tells you essentially how much damage they do, and you'll notice that monsters in this game mode do not roll for damage. They just do average damage. That does make the game more consistently deadly instead of more swingy, so you kind of know how much damage you're going to take from every hit. It makes sense, and you'll see why. It speeds up the resolution. You don't want the game to crawl to a halt, basically. So you'll see combat behavior explains how the orc behaves in combat. So it prioritizes the nearest visible enemy that is not engaged by 2 or more allies, unless it's the only threat. And then it attacks until the target dies. So these things will keep hitting you if you fall unconscious. Now, this whole trait could be completely removed, and you could just simply follow the combat action table, which is down below it. I just wanted to make sure that it helped with anti-metagaming, and it lets you, the person controlling the monster, make the decision for it in a way that makes the most sense. So let's move into the combat actions here. The orc may move up to its speed, and then it attacks with the highest damage option available. If no melee target is in range, it uses a ranged attack. If no attacks are possible, it takes the dodge action. Roll a d6 to determine its action. And then you'll see it's a very, very simple chart. On a 1 to 2, it just makes an attack. On a 3 to 4, it makes an attack at advantage. On a 5, it makes 2 attacks. And on a 6, it does a finishing maneuver, basically. So it whirls its great sword over its head and it tries to decapitate you. So if this reduces you to 0, you are decapitated. However, this is basically a reckless attack for the orc, so you will have advantage on attack rolls against it until the start of its next turn. And then if you disarm it with some sort of combat maneuver, that attack becomes a 5 instead of a 6, because number 6 requires its great axe to use. So pretty self-explanatory. It's a very intuitive, albeit a novel way to have a stat block run itself without a computer. So the next part we obviously have to get into is the most important part of this entire thing that holds the game together, and that is the dungeon crawling. How does that work in a system where there is no game master? Well, let's get into that. So in Together We Fall, you don't need a person to run the dungeon. The dungeon runs itself on a simple set of rules. Players either roll or they draw from a deck of cards to see what room they are about to enter, and then they face whatever comes next until they reach the boss. That is the gameplay loop of Together We Fall. Let's break down how it works step by step. So step 1, so obviously somebody does have to make the dungeon. I think collaboratively, if you sit down at the table with a group of people and you go through what each room of the dungeon could be, it would be a fun group exercise in collaborative storytelling. So the first thing you do is you pick a dungeon theme. This is the DNA of the dungeon crawl. It decides the vibe, the look of the dungeon, the danger. Examples would be, is it a crypt? Is it an arid desert? Is it a underground cave system? Is it under the water? That's up to you to decide at the table, but the motif is important because you want the themes of every room to fit in with that motif. If you're in a crypt, you should be running into skeletons and sarcophagi. The next step is to set the DC of the dungeon. This is a universal difficulty of the level itself. This number covers every check within the dungeon that is environmental, not creatures, but the environment in the dungeon itself. This sets the DC for, let's say, jumping over a pit, or dodging a trap, or resisting a poison. Anything that involves being in the dungeon, this DC is part of that. It also decides how much experience points you get upon completing the dungeon. So step 3 would be you choose the size of the dungeon. You got small, medium, large, huge, or mega. And the size basically means how many rooms before you might hit the boss. And number 4 would be the countdown die. So how the countdown die works is after you've cleared the minimum rooms for the size of the dungeon, you roll a special die each time you enter a new room. and if you roll a 1, that next room that you open is the boss room. You've entered the final room of the dungeon. So once we've picked our size, which determines our countdown die, now we need to generate each room. Right now, how I do it is I made a D100 crawl table to see what encounter you face based on the D100 roll, but this system works way better if you just make a deck of cards with each dungeon room. You draw a card instead of rolling, and then you set the card off to the side so you can't enter the same room twice. It's way faster and actually probably more intuitive that way. Now, once you've created the dungeon, and let's say your table enters the dungeon, the next thing you're going to do is determine the marching order of the party. The reason why this is important is whoever's in front of the party is the one who rolls or draws from the deck and enters the room. They are also the first to face whatever danger that encounter has within that room. So if there is a dart trap that shoots out poison needles, whoever is in the front of the marching order that rolled that encounter, they're the one that gets hit if they fail the saving throw. Sometimes it might be an AoE, but for the most part, the person in front should be not a person that is injured, because let's say the cleric got beat up by a bunch of skeletons in the room before, and he's really low hit points. He enters the next room, there's a swinging scythe trap that does 20 damage if he fails the saving throw. He might get chopped in half, so you want to make sure the hardier people are in the front of the marching order. Now, we have a bunch of different room types for these encounters. I've come up with a few of them. So we have skill tests, conundrums, hazards, traps. You can have an attacked room where you just get into combat. A treasure room that's just a safe room where you get loot. You can have a gauntlet, which is one huge mega encounter that is also rare, with a usual reward of a shortcut and good loot. And then you can have a boon room, which might be a rare permanent upgrade, increasing your hit point cap by 5. Now, the final step for the dungeon crawling is obviously going to be the boss room. This is going to be how the dungeon ends. This is the climax of the dungeon crawl. It's usually going to be a fairly difficult boss fight. If you beat the boss, your party completes the dungeon, you get the XP reward, and then you go back to town and rest. So that kind of covers how dungeon crawling works in Together We Fall. Let me just show you a couple examples of rooms that I've made on my D100 encounter table. So for example, let's look at my crawl table that I started making here. I never finished this thing because it took a while, and I figured what would be a lot better for this if I just made a deck of cards. But let's look at how I have it laid out. So on this D100 table, let's say we rolled a 1. Which means we get a skill test room. So there's a opening description that reads, "A circular chamber opens before you. Its floor is a faded mosaic of knights battling ghouls. Sickly green mist coils just above the tiles. Above you, the circumference of the entire chamber, hangs a cracked iron bell." And then it says, "Skill test. Nominate a character to make an int investigation or a whiz perception check versus the dungeon DC. On a success, a series of tile traps are spotted, and you Sherpa your party through the chamber safely. On a failure, a trap triggers, sending the bell plummeting down from the ceiling, and then the party has to make a dex save to avoid 2d10 bludgeoning damage." So the room is a very gamified way to dungeon crawl. There's not a lot of freedom to just roam around the room and ask the DM 100 questions because, again, there is no DM. So a lot of people probably won't like this, but how else are you going to run the game without a dungeon master? This is probably the coolest and most straightforward, fun way to do it. Now you can probably still have role playing and all this other stuff. If you want to, the Arbiter could probably just come up with, hey, there might be a monster in this room too. Or maybe you guys get into a big roleplay argument right in the middle of the room as well. Let's look at one more. Let's say we rolled a 5 or a 6 on this table. The corridor widens into a sunken chapel, waist high in brackish water. Shattered pews bob against the walls while ghostly green shapes drift beneath the surface. Before you can react, a screaming, ghastly figure rises from the water towards whoever entered the room first. Attacked! The character that rolled this room number must make a dex save versus the dungeon DC. On a success, you lurch backwards enough for the creature to miss. On a failure, you feel the chill of elongated ghostly fingers reaching into your chest, and you take 1d8 cold damage. You can't regain HP for the first round of combat. And then it says, combat begins. 2 glowing specters rise out of the water of this waist-high flooded room, and movement is difficult terrain in this combat unless you have a swimming speed. So there's a bit of a twist in this one. You can't move fast through this room, but the ghosts probably could. Hello, post-video editing Anthony here, and thank you for watching this video. It was a fun one to make. I made this module quite a long time ago, but never got around to making a video for it, so I figured now was the time because I haven't made a 5e video in so long. So if you want to see another video by me of me making a creature stat block, click this video here. I think you'll like it. Otherwise, I have been DM Dungeon Mastery. I'm not saying goodnight. I'm just saying. I'll catch you in the next one.